what I think we're being asked to do when we're addressing the topic of competing modernities is really also trying to understand a bit about how competition works in terms of institutions and their growth and their self-legitimating practices. And if we're thinking about institutions and how they legitimate themselves, we can think in terms of dynamics, internal, external dynamics, and we can then also start to think about how particular approaches to culture, knowledge, art, and so forth come about if we're actually operating in respect of these dynamics. And so what we're really entering then is a very much non-neutral space of culture, a space you might say of cultural politics. And what I'm sort of quite keen to engage now, or to sort of assert then, is what legacies these cultural politics, these dynamics have on our ability to think, to learn, to articulate, to understand, to communicate, and so on in the present. And I think, we can continually return to this question, whether as artists, curators, academics, writers, and so on, because all of us, by the very nature of our being here in this room, have something to contribute to this. You might call it an unlearning process, a relearning process, whatever. We're all participants. Okay, but what I think these two papers did was really show us the power relationships involved in the making of exhibitions, whether in the 30s or the 80s. And what I think they both did was sort of highlight the problems around modernism in different ways. Thinking about then how, in the first paper, Indian modernism was this sort of perhaps then unbroachable space of engagement, and then in the second paper, one that can be used, or was very kind of clearly used to legitimate the work going on in Oxford. So that's interesting then, isn't it, that it was happening at that time in the 1980s. And I think, something that I perhaps want to come to a little later, if we have time, is why it took the UK so long to understand the Global South. Given that the Global South was a concept that really featured in international politics from the 1950s onwards. So there are then effects on there of this this lack, or this lacunae, in terms of the British and their perhaps inability to understand India's place in the world according to these new forms of multilateral engagement that came up through decolonization, through nation building, and so on. So let us then come on to sort of some more specific points. What I liked in the first paper was the fact that we're able to really sort of address this whole kind of gatekeeping practice. We're able to think about how exhibitions, through their layering, through their sort of quite clear attitude towards the historic and towards historicity, develop these sort of narratives that have various degrees of coherence. And Brinda, I think, did very well in highlighting these in terms of arcs, which I think is kind of a neatly poetic term that both sort of kind of creates a shape, doesn't it, for these narratives, but then also in the arcness of the arc kind of leaves space for all kinds of perhaps more intangible practices and more intangible elements. So with it is a sort of a certain sense of non-linearity, or a certain kind of linearity that's just kind of not straight, basically. And then in the second paper, what I thought was quite interesting was that we have this language of aspects. So thinking about the narrativization through the sort of the threading, or the what can come through sort of interconnected narratives or interweaving. I think this is a sort of a neatly. I think this is a useful contribution. But I'm also wanting to sort of think about the 1980s at a time in which these narratives actually became quite important, when we're also thinking about history writing more generally after independence and in a post-colonial setting. You know, we could perhaps compare aspects of modern art with, for example, Ranjit Guha's, let's say, pioneering work on the elementary aspects of peasant insurgency in colonial India. So I'm just sort of playing on, you know, the aspects point where, you know, for Guha, you know, he's actually very interested in what constituted a subaltern voice or a subaltern consciousness through the narration of a particular sort of insurgent position. So let's just perhaps be a little bit more careful when we're using terms like insurgency, because you know, insurgency actually means something, doesn't it, in the subaltern context. So then, what can we sort of make of this? If we're thinking about subaltern knowledges, subaltern spaces, if we're sort of left with this ongoing vexation about whether and how to address subaltern spaces and subaltern peoples, we, I think, can then use you know, the prisms that are opened up, you know, through these modern artists in critical ways. So to work with those insights generated through the artistic practices, and then to explore and to come to some sort of new understanding of these worlds, and then also the worlding process that would then accompany either their presence or their absence in these institutions. So basically, I think it's a very much unresolved process. I think that's sort of wherein some of the intellectual responsibility comes for some of us here, to continually sort of return to these questions. You know, one of the reasons why I'm sort of focusing on the subaltern element is because yesterday we were talking in terms of craft and in terms of you know, the concept of the deshi, how that relates to Swadeshi, how it relates to a deshi marga kind of symbiosis and so forth. And this is where I think the modern artists, the Indian modern artists, especially in the pre-independence phase, had some very important interventions to make. You know, and through that, then we can sort of understand some of these perhaps more marginal, or what people used to call kind of peripheral spaces in terms of the economic, cultural, political dynamics that were situated there. And to, in that sort of gesture, also kind of descend to the whole thing. Okay, so then, if I may, just sort of spend one or two moments just thinking about cultural diplomacy and knowledge diplomacy, because this is where I think we can start to sort of find some areas of overlaps and sort of areas of binding, if you like, between the visual arts, between the art historiographies, between, you know, them and also the way the institutions generate their place in the world. Because what we in fact find is that all of these social spaces are quite sort of interconnected through these institutions. And I think what we can learn from the Indian situation after independence is that the institutions that were coming up at the national level were corresponding to perhaps a slightly kind of more nuanced sense of how cultural values can come into play when you know, making decisions about you know, how to conserve culture, how to make heritage something of value in the present. And this is something that I think is playing out. Obviously, it played out in a kind of a Gandhian way in the 50s and so on, but nowadays, obviously, it's playing out more in a sort of a Hindutva type ideology. So then let's ask kind of the question then about, you know, whether and how the Hindutvites are sort of generating their own forms of cultural diplomacy, their own ways of translating into new spaces some of these perhaps marginal knowledges and practices. That's sort of slightly kind of veering off from the papers, but nonetheless, you know, if we're thinking about competing modernities, we can think about, well, what the kind of terms of the competition are right now, you know, in terms of secularism versus non-secularism, in terms of, you know, all kinds of competing multilateralisms and all sorts. But what I would say then, just kind of to close, is that we are also in a space, given our sort of centeredness here, to kind of continue to work together and to think together. And I think it'd be very interesting to sort of, perhaps in a few months' time, return to some of the issues that have been played out in this conference, to think about how new research agendas can come up, and how, through our collaboration, we can also start to then reclaim, from the STEM subjects, within the humanities, within the social sciences, our own stake, because, it's through the great work being done by all these modern and contemporary artists that we do actually then have, the possibility to create new things. Okay. So.
All right, so I see Ella has a pile of mics, which are going around, and like yesterday, I'm going to request that you speak your question as directly as possible into the mic so that it can be recorded and heard by everyone else in the room. Like yesterday, I'm going to ask that we pool 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll take a round of responses from the speakers, and then we'll see how many times we can do that before our time is up. All right, questions, comments. David?
Thank you very much. I thought they were both incredible expositions, and also learning so much about British culture this morning, and the introduction of certain ideas into British culture. Just to say a little bit about the Indian season at Oxford, which actually wasn't formally part of the Festival of India. It's worth saying that. It happened outside, and that was one of the points of it. And there was a process by which Al-Qazi made this approach through Victor Musgrave. Victor Musgrave rang me. But we didn't immediately say, oh yeah, we'll take the money and thank you very much, just stick the exhibition there in the corner. And there is a very important context to this, which is what was going on in British art through the late 70s and the beginning of the 80s. I mean, you mentioned, Hilary, the New Spirit, Neuer's Geist, which, I mean, was a cataclysmic event. I mean, because, we kind of realized that the avant-garde had rolled over and died sometime in 1974, but quite what was in its place, no one knew. And the market was saying, oh, it's painting, painting, painting. Yep, nothing against painting. But there was this whole problem. If you were a curator, and I was an art historian, I was interested in the context of the contemporary. My specialisms have been German Expressionism and Paul Gauguin. And all of a sudden, I mean, Donald Judd and American minimalism I was particularly interested in, and what had been happening in America, because that had so much influenced Britain in the 50s and 60s. But there was really a question of what to do. And you say, oh, well, yeah, oh, Baselitz, yeah, he was painting in 1960, and all of a sudden he's fantastic. It was just over the channel. He was making good work in 60s and 70s. Why in the hell didn't we know about it if we were good curators? So what is this sea change going on? It's like an ideological instruction came from above, and all of a sudden you had to be one thing or the other. And I mean, the art world, I mean, it was very badly funded in the 70s, but and it was a small group of people, but it was extremely regimented. You were either Green Mountain or Red Mountain, to put it in an American context of your theoretical position. And all of a sudden, everything was up for grabs, and I guess if you were smart, you'd be jumping from one log onto the next log. And this came up at a particular moment where we're looking back at figuration, to other histories, and this idea that the contemporary art is not purely a Western European and North American phenomenon. And in fact, the whole idea of alterity, and alterity relating to the idea of comparison, which is an art historical method, became very, very important. And so this suddenly happened then, and there was that possibility of interjecting it into the British flow. Now, the other side that was going on was Ron Kittai, Human Clay, an exhibition that took place in the late 70s about figuration and the whole move towards figuration in British art. And then you mentioned Peter Kinley. It wasn't just a picture, his Indian paintings, which were a part of this. I mean, huge numbers of paintings of the Wiltshire countryside as well. But Peter Kinley had a kind of Boris Johnson, Michael Gove relationship with Howard Hodgkin. And Howard Hodgkin was one of the gatekeepers of Indian art in Britain. And I mean, Bhupan was well looked after by Howard Hodgkin. And there was a kind of interesting thing there, but the work was terrific, of course. And that was why it was interpolated into that discussion. Tim Hyman also has to come into this. Mellon Foundation about British art. You know, there is this whole dialogue going on at that time into which this series of exhibitions was plopped. Anyway, the Myth and Reality show, the condition that I did it after going to India, checking through, making sure I'm happy, was that I selected all the works in the show, and with Victor. And Victor and I had to agree. And obviously, as Al-Qazi was paying, but he couldn't really object. That was the deal.
Thank you, David. So what I will ask is that Hamad, Geeta, and then the hand at the back, may I request, because in the interest of time, in the interest of having a round of responses, that your questions be pointed and as brief as possible. Thank you.
With that instruction, I'll be very pointed and point, in fact, to one of the issues that was raised yesterday about how we sort of move discussions beyond sort of an India-dominated framework and to think about what the treatment of contemporary miniature and its exhibitions in the UK and the parallels they frame. And I'm thinking in particular of the exhibitions Karkhana, which was originally in the Rochdale, at the Touchstones Gallery in Rochdale, and then the exhibition which sort of kind of built from that, and a disclaimer here, I curated it, looking at beyond the page, the idea of miniature as an attitude. And one of the issues that was coming out of it was actually a huge resistance on part of the art and sort of the discursive community as to the legitimacy of miniature practice as a contemporary practice. Mm-hmm. And I think there are many, many sort of parallels that could be drawn with some of the exhibitions and some of the issues that in particular you've been looking at, Brenda. But I think it also spills over into your paper, Hilary.
Geeta.
It's not a question, it's a comment. And it might have to do with how old I am. But this very, very fine empirical and analytical papers. But I do think that we also have to remember that they not these papers, but the conference itself and the discussions sometimes might seem like a Pilgrims Progress, that we have been as if, you know, crossing the stations of the, we've been going through the stations of the cross. And I just wondered if we can stop being pilgrims and stop holding the cross. Because I think the debate in many ways now is on different kinds of notions of alterity also. This is not to do with the historical account, which is extremely necessary in order to be able to extrapolate what that difference is. But it seems that while we do the historical work, there has to be a recognition of the fact that this is a 20th century phenomenon which we have lived through and which formed the basis of a very important discourse. But the discourse shifts, and then you stop being the pilgrim who's proving the point.
Thank you. The question at the back, and I'm going to ask that we start the second round with your questions, but we should get a round of responses from the speakers.
Hello, and thank you for your wonderful papers. I come as a total outsider. I'm an art historian, but this is a topic pretty much new to me, but I have a keen interest in it at the moment as I work in collaboration with many others on an art market dictionary, where we want to bring together the galleries that were pivotal in, sort of in historic periods up to now. So my question is very much focused on with that research background. Who were the gallerists, the commercial enterprises that brought these kind of artists onto the market first? Because I know there existed a Persian gallery, sort of just after 1900, just like a Dutch gallery, and they were all called after the artists they represented. So there was a Dutch gallery, and there was a German gallery, and there was an Italian gallery, and there was a Persian gallery. And I'm quite interested to find out which gallery would have presented contemporary artists, in 1920. And yes, contemporary meaning exactly that. So living artists, if that existed. Thank you.
May I request that we hear from the speakers and continue our discussion offline? All right, Brinda Hillary.
So, thank you for those range of comments. Hamad and Gita, I take your points. I think it's one of the things that I'm trying to do with my paper is to actually point to the fact that these are shifting discursive spaces. These exhibitions, as they occur in specific moments in history, and they speak to what the ongoing discourse and priorities are. And I think there is this tension, between the space, for instance, of the miniature, and then how that gets, the charge of that gets contoured in particular ways in a post-colonial moment and on either sides of the border as well. And I think there is a way in which one needs to be able to situate where these kinds of resistances are coming. I mean, Dan spoke of this idea of the competition, and I think that there are always competing visions of how South Asia, how the nation is to be represented through these exhibitions, and I think inevitably these exhibitions become flashpoints of one sort of ideas of that, and I think one should be aware of the fact that these are multifarious strands always, and there is a kind of dominance and hierarchy that brings certain agendas to the surface, whether it's through individuals, whether it's through specific institutions. So just to kind of like gesture towards that, but also keeping in mind of these shifting targets and being somewhat limber in how one considers these shifting priorities.
Hillary.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I don't know if this is working. Yes, and I mean, I think, people very rightly talk about David Elliott's curating as being often before its time. And, but I think what I tried to do is put it back in its time in order to show what it was, what it was really trying to do. And David has said, more than I could really in the space of a short paper, but it was, I absolutely think that, the India project was part of this much wider, much more ambitious program for the museum that really needs to be understood in terms of, discourses about the avant-garde and so on within Britain in the late 70s and early 80s. The connection to the Soviet exhibitions, for example, I think is quite interesting. So yeah, I think very much trying to reroute these things and resist the idea to say, oh, how contemporary. Because in fact, it was a long time ago, and things were very different. They really were, and we can't take that for granted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see several hands. You were first. The person.
And I just wanted to, just to the point of the collectors and dealers at that moment. There was, for instance, I mentioned Ajit Ghosh. He was considered himself a collector, but there were oftentimes they played multiple roles, and there was, however, the dealer Imre Schweiger, who was based in London and Delhi, who lent work to the exhibition, and so there were these characters who do, appear in both places as well.
I just want to quickly move back in, sorry. So when they You mentioned that, lots of especially the manuscripts ended up in the V&A, and they were exhibited at the Royal Academy. So did they you couldn't buy at the Royal Academy exhibition, could you? Were there agents in between?
No. Those were lent by individuals to the exhibition, and subsequently would be either bequeathed to the V&A. So that's how it most often ended up in those collections.
Right, and similarly, of course, one has to acknowledge that Al-Qazi was a very important dealer in his own right, but there was no commercial dimension to the Oxford exhibitions at all. That was very deliberate. The name of his gallery was nowhere, no works for sale, and he was very much at pains to kind of to articulate the difference between those two projects.
Okay, good. The question in the front, then at the back.
Thank you very much. They're really great papers. And obviously, I think everyone knows that a lot of things perhaps haven't changed given Jonathan Jones's recent scathing, hideous article. And thank you, Geeta, for your response that you wrote something that was great. But I want to know more about audience figures and how are these, in the context of other exhibitions, how are these populated and, yeah, the figures, essentially.
Okay.
There were, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Brenda. Is that okay if we take a couple more if we can? Go ahead. Yes, please.
Just following on from some things that have been said over the last couple of days. It seems every 5 or 6 years we have this India season here in the UK. It was in France.
One next year.
And I think the Fabric of India, which opened last September, was the beginning of that India season over the last 6 months. And I think the Pen show is a sort of culmination of that. And there was things on the media and so on, and television and radio and things like that. And there's a celebration of India, and then you move on to Mexico, China, and elsewhere. And it seems so we keep coming back to this discussion. And I think, we've been talking about the last century, but what's next? And I think is this idea of trying to do a survey show of a landmass the size and as diverse as Europe. I mean, is that really a good starting point? And should the curatorial and academic institutional community say, we don't want to do shows on India? I think that one has to be more specific, and I think therein lies some of the fault lines, because I think also this idea of India-centricness and what Sharmini said yesterday about where the funding comes from and why these shows are important. So I'd just like to hear some thoughts on that.
Wonderful, thank you. So I see Yutika's hand up, so we'll take Yutika's comment, and I think then we'll hear from the speakers.
Hi, thanks very much for those very enlightening papers and something that not very sort of known to me as a subject. But I was quite taken with Geeta's comment and your comment as well about the audience figures, and I wondered on the back of that, I suppose one of the interesting possibilities to think about sort of contemporary discourse in the context of these events is to think about the seeing aspect, so actually the sort of looking and the experiencing of these spaces, and I wonder whether that, highlighting some of that would bring back the criticality, I suppose, of the discourse itself, and especially given the rise of art criticism around that time. So I would see a possibility in that.
May I say something briefly that's by way of comment, but perhaps it can be generative of discussion, if not right now, at some later moment, that I was struck in listening to the two papers by not so much, well, I mean, certainly the idea of canon formation and museum collections and so on, but the category of world art emerging, world art, or what now we might call global modernisms or something like that, emerging in and through early exhibitions, and even as early as the 1930s when you think about the exhibition of Chinese art and Persian art and so on, because there's a way in which you are getting national or civilizational claims with these exhibitions, but there are also interconnections being posited through these exhibitions, being organized by the same body or in the same exhibition space. So, like you were thinking about connections between the India exhibitions and the Soviet Union exhibitions, that maybe we can see the germs in these kinds of projects already of a topic that we all seem to be talking about with passion and animation these days, right? World art studies or global art history.
Yes, I mean, I think the short answer is that, in fact, you could also kind of argue that goes back earlier to, you talk about great exhibitions and the idea of empire and world and coming under and that itself kind of feeding into the encyclopedic museum. And so there is an interconnectivity between them, but it's also interesting to see how regions get articulated, and under under burgeoning nationalisms, how certain kinds of ideas of Chinese art, Persian art, and and therefore in some ways putting a certain pressure on ideas of Islamic art more broadly, Asian art, and then Indian art kind of fitting relative to those categories. So I think these one needs to kind of also, when one's thinking, considering the category of South Asia as well, also be aware of how that's constituted as, both in exhibitionary spaces, museum spaces, but also, where you are, whether you're in the UK or then, in the US. And so how that's a shifting space. But there is always a kind of relative, relationship between those. And I think, in historical terms, it would often get seen in terms of like the burdens of influence and seeing, kind of measuring that, and even how art history shifts in terms of its terminology through these exhibitions is worth considering. But just to the point of visitorship and keeping that in mind. For the exhibition that I was addressing, it was, as I said, it was in a small private club, but it was apparently you could get an invitation quite easily. The figures were, there were over 1,400 visitors, and plus not including the members of the club, which are about 350 members or so. Not as big as the exhibitions of Egyptian art or Chinese art that had taken place some years earlier. So again, relatively speaking, it's good to keep in mind how much interest are these really, garnering, and again, one comes up against the limits of archival material in being able to fully flesh out how the impact is. One has to get creative about kind of piecing together these puzzles as well, and take multiple approaches to kind of figure out a framework of reference. But that's.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I thought I would just take 2 points, maybe. The question about audiences is really interesting, and indeed there is a shortage of information sometimes. I did find figures for these exhibitions, and the Aspects show was the least attended of the 3 blocks of Indian shows, and I think it was the least attended in 1982, which was admittedly a pretty stellar year for Modern Art Oxford, MoMA. Which is interesting. And by far the most popular exhibition was The Gods of the Byways. Again, no data as to why that might be. They were both widely reviewed. And my favorite anecdote about the response to the Aspects exhibition was from the Economic Times review. The critic had obviously, it was a slightly batty review, but the critic had obviously talked to Roshan Al-Qazi, and who had told her that lots of visitors, particularly the elderly, had to leave the exhibition because they were so overwhelmed by the colour. And they would have to come back later when they kind of girded their loins. In general, though, I think the best responses that I found to the exhibitions were the children's poems written in response to Gods of the Byways as part of the education program, and they came with drawings, and there was a huge amount of kind of descriptive information in these poems, which was so delightful. For example, there was no mention anywhere in the archives that there was a soundtrack to the show, but there was, it was so interesting to see the kind of sensory responses that these children were registering to the art, how it was obviously revolutionizing their idea of what a museum could be. They write in their poems, I didn't know a museum could be so bright. That kind of thing is so precious because it shows up the kind of limitations of relying on published professional art criticism in order to kind of evaluate the lived response to an exhibition. Unfortunately, it's quite hard to find. So.
Well, thank you for that. We are out of time, and I thank the speakers and Dan for wonderful presentations and responses, and to all of you for your thoughtful engagement. We will reconvene in, 15 minutes, not 45 minutes, at 11:45. Please, is that correct? Oh, no, lovely, we do. a nice coffee break. All right, 25 minutes. I'll see you back here.